Well, hello everyone. Rita McGrath here. You probably knew that. And I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Jean Oelwang, who is the founding CEO of Virgin Atlantic's charitable arm, the Virgin Unite, as well as a force behind the Elders, the Planetary Guardians, Plus Wonder, all kinds of really wonderful organizations trying to make positive change happen in the world. She has a relatively new book, came out in 2022, called Partnering, which is full of the most amazing, amazing stories. So Jean, just welcome. And I'm so delighted that you were able to make the time.
Thank you, Rita, and thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So let's start with your journey for people that aren't familiar with your work. So you started off on the corporate rat race and were told that war is, work is battle, and the dominant alpha person, preferably the alpha male, right? If you just share a little bit about your journey, I think that would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Rita. And so I did. I started out in the corporate world, and actually, ironically, the first two books I got when I think I was by my first well-intentioned boss when I was in my early 20s. The first one was The Art of War on How to Survive in Corporate America. And then the second one, just in case I didn't make it, was The Joy of Cooking, which I still have the copy of that with the burnt edges that I've never sadly learned how to cook. But that kind of was my early stages, and it set me on this path for the first probably 18 years of my career to really focus on how I could break as many glass ceilings as possible in the telecommunications sector. So I spent about 18 years building mobile phone companies in different parts of the world. And during that period, I took a couple detours, and one of them was becoming a Vista volunteer in America in Center City, Chicago, working with homeless teenagers and refugees. And I think, Rita, there, I guess my focus shifted where I started to see how broken the systems were, whether it was business or not-for-profit or government, and how these young people, in this case, were falling through those cracks. And then I took another detour and went international and worked on helping build these mobile phone companies in places like South Africa, Colombia, Bulgaria, Singapore. And I think there I watched how quickly we could scale these mobile phone companies. And I became fascinated with why weren't we scaling social and environmental issues as quickly, and what systemically was stopping us from doing that. And then my last detour was probably working for Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife in Australia. And again, saw the same issues not getting solved, not sharing globally what we were doing. And then I pivoted back into and started working for Virgin Mobile in Australia. And then had a chance, I overheard my boss talking about wanting to build a foundation. And so I went home, put together a plan, and that was 20 some years ago, we launched Virgin Unite.
Wow, and that would have been Richard Branson, of course.
Yeah.
which is stunning. Those of you who are interested in looking on the web, you'll see pictures of Jean next to Richard Branson, sometimes without a shirt, sometimes with one.
Probably when he has a shirt on. Much better.
Those of you who are just partnering us, just joining us, the book is called Partnering, and it's full of just amazing stories from Jean's background. And I'd love you to describe how you got into the power of partnering, because I'm with you. I mean, I see so many of these systems and they just seem to be broken. And one of the most moving stories in your book is the story of, a young man who murdered the only son of a man who subsequently became his friend. And that's not an everyday sort of thing that happens.
No, and it's that's Azeem and Plez, just two amazing human beings. And as you said, Azeem's son was, I think, 19, and Plez's grandson was 14 when he shot him in a gang prank. And I think none of us would have felt bad, I guess, discredited Azeem for not wanting to ever see Plez again, but instead he invited him into his living room and started this path of conversation and bridging divides. And that was some 35 or close to 40 years ago. And they became like brothers, deeply close friends, and started a foundation where they now get up on stages all over America in high schools to stop kids from killing kids. And they call themselves spiritual brothers. And it's, I now, as Plez's son, Felix, is getting out of prison, or he got out of prison about 2 years ago. And the first thing Azeem did was hired him into his foundation. And to me, Rita, it's just that story. We are so divided right now, particularly in America. And so when anyone tells me we can't cross bridges or we can't come together, I just think of Azeem and Plez and how they came together across a tragedy that none of us could even imagine. And but just to your question around how I got into focus on partnerships, I think, Rita, that when I started my career and I got those 2 books, I think I was so focused on how could I break these glass ceilings and get up to CEO role, get up to board role, that I one day just turned around and looked at myself and I found that I had lost a lot of who I was, and I felt more lonely than ever before in a CEO role. And so it started me thinking about what is important to me in life. And I, at that same time, had the good fortune to be starting to work at Virgin Unite and watch a group called the Elders, which are this amazing group of leaders that were founded by Nelson Mandela and his amazing wife, Graça. And they're people that were, primarily former politicians. Like at the time, it was President Carter. It was also Kofi Annan, who was at the helm of the UN at the time, Mary Robinson. And I started watching these people, Rita, and I started to think about how did they become who they were in this world? And what became very clear to me was that they became who they were through the relationships and the partnerships that they created. And that set me off on this journey where I started to interview some of the elders to see how they built these deep connections. And originally it started out actually as a book about romantic partnership. And then I interviewed Ben and Jerry, and the whole book changed because I started to realize that the same thing that made these deep connections work in a romantic relationship or in a friendship were the same things that made a business work and that were at the center of a business. And Ben and Jerry really pivoted the whole thesis of the book.
Wow. So the elders in the book, you talk about coming together as it was first being formed, and Jimmy Carter basically pouring ice water on your idea. I mean, it's a very honest sort of conversation, but I think his point was he didn't want it to be just another space where important people talked, right? That he actually wanted to connect it to some kind of outcomes, and that proved to be fruitful.
Yeah. And I even when you just said that, I get PTSD because I'll never forget that moment when I was standing up there so proud to be presenting this idea. And he stood up and he's like, I don't believe in it. I don't think it's going to work. And I remember looking at the back of the room because it was really the idea of my boss, Richard Branson, and his friend, Peter Gabriel, and their heart, you could just see their hearts sinking into the floor. I wanted to disappear into the cement. But it was a really important learning lesson for me because we pulled ourselves together and we spent the next 2 weeks sitting with President Carter, with Archbishop Tutu, but also with incredible frontline leaders, with business leaders, with not-for-profit leaders. And we really co-created the idea of the elders. And it was a super important lesson for me because I had come in, from corporate America with my perfect PowerPoint and spent 3 months working on it. And, what we came out after those 3 weeks was way better and deeper and richer than what I had walked in the door with. So it was a really important lesson around authentic co-creation. And, that was 20 plus years ago. And we never made that mistake again where we didn't authentically co-create and come to the table to really innovate together rather than thinking we had the right idea. And it was funny because, President Carter then became probably the biggest supporter of the elders because he was part of the co-creation. And years later, when he retired and well into his 90s from the elders, he stood up and he said, this is one of the most important things I've ever done in my life. And again, I believe because it was because of that co-creation with a group of very diverse people.
And the different perspectives people bring must have been amazing. And I think one of the things that struck me in the book and about your own work is how much human hope there is in it. My husband is a news junkie, and I don't think it's good for him these days.
Definitely not good for him.
I set my limits because there's just always so much of a deluge of bad bad faith, bad news, political maneuvering, blaming out groups for everything that's wrong. And your work really offers a bit of an antidote to that, a bit of hope. And one of the stories that runs throughout the book is the story of how we kind of figured out how to stop the hole in the ozone layer from continuing, and eventually led to actions that got to it healing. And to me, that's a wonderful, really uplifting example of a large-scale social change that actually worked. So maybe unpack that for us a little bit. And then if you want to talk about each of the principles of the partnerships that you talk about in the book, that would be great too.
Yeah, and thank you. And also thank you for your work. I mean, you're such a community builder, connector, just extraordinary. I have the privilege to be part of one community that I know you helped start. And those are points of hope, I think, right now. And I think that sense of community and that sense of building these circles of deep connection are what gives us hope and keeps us going. And, Tutu used to call it that we're all prisoners of hope. And which is, I love that phrase. And yeah, super powerful. And I think, we don't have the luxury of not having hope, and we cannot allow ourselves not to have that hope for future generations that are coming up and leave them with no hope. So, but you're right, like the ozone story, I am obsessed with. This is it's just an amazing cast of characters. And for the last probably 15 or so years now, I've been sitting at their feet, learning from them. And, I was thinking about it when, before I got on this podcast, because you have that beautiful book on inflection points. And I was actually thinking about the early years, because it all started in around 1974 when these two amazing scientists were Sherry and Mario were really discovering that CFCs, which at the time, if anyone that's listening to this and as old as I am, you'll remember that they were in hairspray, they were in deodorant, they're in refrigerators, were destroying the ozone layer. And it was really interesting because when they first found out, they were so passionate about it that they published an article in Nature magazine immediately, and they thought the whole world would react. And instead, the world did the opposite, because they got attacked by their fellow professors. They got attacked by the $8 billion CFC industry, calling them spies. Students stopped coming to their classes. And this didn't last just for a day or a year or even a month. It lasted for an entire decade. And I had the really good fortune to meet Mario before he sadly passed in 2020. And I asked him, I said, Mario, how on earth did you weather these attacks and keep on going? And he said, friendship. He just said that simple word to me, friendship. He said, Sherry and I were so close, we were never going to stop until the world listened. And they didn't. And a decade later, 3 scientists at the British Antarctic Survey and an amazing American scientist, Susan Solomon, and others, proved that there was this hole in the ozone layer. But the inflection point was interesting for companies, because if you take DuPont, which was the largest producer of CFCs in the world at the time, when in 1988, when there was absolute scientific proof that there was a hole in the ozone layer, the chief scientist in DuPont, Mac McFarland, had the courage to align with another leader, Joseph Glass, and they came together and convinced DuPont's leadership that they needed to phase out CFCs. And the interesting part of this is that they did it before there was government regulation, which I think, again, was a really courageous move on their behalf, and then helped to move the rest of the industries. And then Glass actually was one of the ones who helped work across competitive lines to phase out CFCs more rapidly, and to make sure that countries that weren't causing the problem had the IP, had the technical assistance, had the funds. So there was a whole group of them within TEEB who make sure that they work towards this goal of phasing out CFCs. But I think the other interesting thing, part of that story, is DuPont was ahead of the inflection point caused by the regulation, because they believed in the science. But the beauty of it was, it also, listening to Mac and Glass, who I didn't obviously know, but they also talked about, like Joseph Glass talked about when he came home that day, when they made the decision to phase CFCs, he told his 6 children and his wife, and they had this amazing celebration. And he talked about how good it felt that he was doing the right thing. And he became one of the leads in DuPont in phasing them out. And then Mac, years later, when he retired from DuPont, TEEB, the organization that was phasing out CFCs, was a combination of environmentalists, activists, government leaders. They had this massive party to celebrate him as being that one that really helped tip companies to start that shift. So I think it's also about culture when you do the right thing and how that kind of builds those deep connections and relationships. But at that inflection point, they were ahead of the curve because they did the right thing. But the ozone community overall, they had so many learnings for us. They had that intoxicating purpose around closing the hole, which everyone could get their arms around, understand. They had really clear targets for companies so that they knew what that roadmap was. They knew when they had to phase out, how they could phase out. They had assistance along the way. So it was a really clear roadmap, which I think we miss sometimes right now. And they had these deep connections at the center, which I think were the most important thing. So you had of diverse connections across all kinds of political and sectorial. So you had the scientists, but you also had Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And we would not, which are two very unlikely environmentalists at the time, but we wouldn't have the Montreal Protocol without them. They helped us bring in, I think it was 197 countries. It's still the most successful treaty of our time. And then you had the public, so it was across sectors and these deep connections at the center. Many of them still, something like 40 years later now, are still working on this issue together. So it's an amazing story of not just hope, but deep success, because by 2065, NASA predicts that the ozone hole will be largely healed.
Wow, that's an
Sorry to
amazing.
go on a bit. I could talk for hours about that story because I love it so much.
It is such a great story. So, what I often find with that though is that it did a few things to solve that problem that I think a lot of social entrepreneurs, people trying to make change in the world, sort of get wrong. So the first thing was everybody knows what a hole is, right?
Yeah.
So they gone to the journal Nature, and they could have said, well, it was a D level concentration of blah blah blah, and their average person's eyes would have glazed over. But everybody knows what a hole is, right? So,
Yeah.
so they made it clear. They also had a clear villain, the CFCs,
Yeah.
and you had this whole first group of actors agreeing on a common course of action, even if some of them would, at least for the short term, suffer a bit financially. And I just think some of our causes, we get too wordy about. The problem is we don't really think about aligning everybody's interests. We don't have those difficult conversations like the one you had to have with the elders and really get people united around, okay, here's the course of action. And I think so many social problems, we just really suffer from not telling our story in a really compelling way.
I 100% agree. I think we almost bend over backwards to confuse people often and don't think about that simplicity and that communication. And I also feel like we don't think about the deep connections at the center enough, that really keep something going and keep the momentum up. And I think that translates into companies as well. I think about that often where when you bring together people, for example, that already have a deep connection and you put them at the center of, say, a board, it changes the dynamic immediately, and it builds that ecosystem of trust more rapidly and respect more rapidly when you have a couple people that already have that deep connection. I don't, when we're building boards, we think about, okay, what kind of people do we want from a title, from an experience, from a, network to be able to raise funds. But we don't often think about those deep connections at the center. And we do that not only in boards, we do that when we start up social causes. Often I see companies and I see social causes that want to own it. They want to be the one to put their brand on it. And that will always limit it to the size of that brand or the size of that person. Or if you build these deep connections at the center and make it more of an open tent, which is, again, what the ozone community were brilliant at, then you're going to scale it much more rapidly. It's going to be exponential rather than, 1 + 1 = 2. It's 1 + 1 = millions. And I think we often miss that thought process around the importance of relationships in our social causes, in our businesses across the board.
I'm completely with you. And I was so struck, you were very kind to invite me to a conversation with some of these very successful social leaders. And I remember overhearing a couple of the people working on the Ozone project talking about, well, if I had to invite somebody to dinner to get them to agree, that's what I would do. If I had to use more, nefarious means, well, that would come into it too. But it was all in the service of a greater cause. And I think a lot of times we think far too narrowly about what we're trying to do. And I'll pick up on this idea of people wanting to own it, because I do see that as an issue in many parts of the social sector, where people are very much about, it's my ego, it's my thing, I want to hang out with my donors, sort of age notions of how to do good work. And I think it's important to kind of tone that down if you really want to bring people together who may not necessarily have completely aligned interests in other areas of their lives, right?
Yeah, and success is when everyone owns it, because then it's going to scale much more rapidly and quickly. And I think the other thing that the not-for-profit sector needs to learn from business sector is more mergers as well. I think being brave and being able to take, like if you start something, being able to realize that coming together. And we did that a few years ago with we started something called the Carbon War Room, which was about market-based models to reduce carbon. And we were, it was a small organization. It was probably at the time, like a $6-8 million budget per annum. And there was this organization called Rocky Mountain Institute, which was started by the amazing scientist Amory Lovins. And they had this incredible technical and scientific rigor, and we had this entrepreneurial rigor. And we merged the two organizations, and we merged Carbon War into RMI. So we lost that brand of Carbon War Room. But it was beautiful because all of the donors at the time in Carbon War Room realized that by doing this, we were going to have a much larger impact in the world. And today, now, a decade or so later, after that merger, that organization, because RMI at the time was probably about a $10 million organization. So it was about a $12-15 million organization when we first merged them. Today, it's well over 200 million, with hundreds of people having incredible impact all over the world. And so I think also just thinking about, particularly in today's world right now, how do we bring things together that are going to have more impact and more effectiveness, and not be frightened to do that?
It's so important that you do that. And again, I'll pick up on this theme of things seem so awful on many dimensions. So perhaps talk a little bit about what characterizes these really deep partnerships, because I know you've done a ton of research on this, looking at people like Ben and Jerry and folks who are solving big problems out there, and some commercial, some not. But perhaps talk about your framework, because I think it's a challenge to some of the things that get taken for granted in business.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of bad happening out there right now. I agree with that in the world, but I think we need to counter that with the stuff that's not being heard, the stuff that's working. And as I mentioned when I interviewed Ben and Jerry, it was just the most amazing 2-hour interview. And I've never, Rita, heard the word love mentioned so much in a business setting in my life, and had so much laughter and joy. And if I take in that interview, a lot of the 6 principles we call the 6 degrees of connection emerged. And because Ben and Jerry, they weren't just starting an ice cream company. When they started their company, they were starting a company that they wanted to change the world. And that was there right from the beginning. And we found this idea of something bigger, this really clear purpose, whether you're a company, whether you're not for profit, so that people have something they can rally around and understand where they're headed is really critical.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was talking to Ben and Jerry, I asked them how on earth did you make Ben and Jerry so successful? And they just looked at me and they giggled, and they said, we were all in. We were 100% there for one another. We 100% had each other's backs. And that really became that second degree about how, when you go into something, you're 100% there and you have each other's backs. And that doesn't mean you're not going to have friction. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it means that people know you're going to be there for the long run with each other. And the third degree that came out across every business that we interviewed, every organization, was this ecosystem of virtues that they had almost as a foundation. And for Ben and Jerry, there were 6 virtues, and the 2 that came out for them and for many others at the very top of the list was a sense of trust and respect. And they talked a lot about how they were friends before they were partners, and they had this deep sense of trust with each other. And then two other things came out when we did this exploration, and we interviewed probably about 65 plus partners, so thousands of pages of transcripts that we coded. And one of them was something we ended up calling magnetic moments. And they were these points that people proactively put, whether they were daily practices, whether they were rituals on an annual basis or a monthly basis, to stay connected. And, some of those were, in Ben and Jerry's case, I'll never forget when they talked about, they had a ton of rituals of joy and fun in the company. But one that I loved, which was really about celebrating failure, was they called it the flavor graveyard. And they actually had ceremonies when a flavor failed, because they wanted to encourage people to take risk and be innovative. And so they made it something fun so that people weren't scared of it. And I can talk about hundreds of other rituals that companies put in place, but really proactively doing that. And Ben and Jerry also had rituals between themselves as co-founders. Like they got a shared boat together. They would spend their weekends together. It's just a beautiful friendship that they built. And the fourth or the fifth degree is another one we hadn't really expected to be so robust, which was around celebrating friction, because every single partnership had friction, but they developed these tools and they had that something bigger that helped them lift above the friction. And one that Ben and Jerry had, which I loved, was something they called the veto card. So that if they got in a really big fight and they couldn't come to an agreement, one of them could hold up the veto card and they wouldn't move forward on that decision. And they said they used it very rarely, but that it saved their friendship and it saved the company over time. And the last degree, the sixth degree, is really how you take these deep connections and ladder them up to collective connections, that what makes the DNA of our companies, of our organizations. And that's, again, where Ben and Jerry did such a good job at making that company, making people feel part of it, part of something bigger, part of something that was a bigger purpose. But those are the 6 degrees that, again, were relevant no matter what type of organization, what type of partnership.
That's super interesting and very human, but also you could see, I mean, I can certainly see how easily those could be damaged, like if you're not incredibly mindful about maintaining those ties, where that could happen. Years ago, Ari Diffuse wrote this wonderful book called The Living Company. And I think he, was sort of working on the same track that you were. And in the book, he very movingly talks about what happens when a company needs to do layoffs. And that if it's done in the sort of classic corporate way, and today, we fire people by Zoom today, it's awful. But he said if it's done in the classic way, what it does is it disrupts the community, and it puts in place kind of a destruction of these very human connections of the kind that you're talking about. And I think that's fascinating. And really good leaders have figured out how to navigate without that. And more resilient companies seem to do better. The companies that have these very human connections. One that I'm thinking of that you talk about in the book is Airbnb. When the bottom dropped out of that business in 2020, I think it was, during the pandemic. Two stories that relate to Brian Chesky, who's their CEO. But the first one was they made a mistake. They unilaterally decided to refund all the deposits and put their hosts in a really terrible position, and then had a lot of repair work to do around that. But the other thing I thought was a really interesting story is how they conducted layoffs in that situation, where they basically said, look, you guys are wonderful people, but we have no money coming in the door and can't, we have to let some people go, or we'll have to let everybody go. And Chesky did it very personally. He said, look, you are wonderful people. I don't regret hiring any of you. I cannot escape business reality. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our recruiting department and turn it into an outplacement service. And we're going to be as human as possible. And when the situation changes, we will welcome you back with open arms. I mean, it was just astonishing. You keep your healthcare, you keep your computer, in other words, even though they weren't going to be part of the same official entity, they were still going to be part of the community, which I thought was just super interesting.
Yeah, and I think what you're bringing up is such an important story, because I feel like Airbnb built their company on trust. They built, like, It was one of the first examples, I think, where we showed the world how important trust is at the center of a company and everything they did. And the story you shared about Brian is so important because I think one of the things that was beautiful when they made that mistake was his transparency and his humanity. Like, if anyone's listening to this that hasn't read that letter that he sent as an apology letter to his hosts, because they could have hidden, and they could have, made amends behind the scenes, and instead he did a very public letter to them. And it was a beautifully written letter, transparent, open, saying that he made a mistake. And, all the partnerships that we interviewed, they talked a lot about how two of the most important words were "I'm sorry." And that ability to have that humility to apologize and to then work together to rebuild trust. And they talked a lot about how when you make mistakes, it's actually a log on the fire of trust, because you strengthen it and you rebuild it. And I think Airbnb is such a beautiful example when Brian did that. And it's interesting, Rita, because we have this network called 100% Human at Work, which is about 500 companies that are piloting different ways to be human in the workplace. And it's interesting, this whole conversation around how you lay people off. Because at one spectrum, we have companies in that network that they will not lay anyone off. They will just find another role for them in their company, all the way through to other companies saying that it's most human to actually remove someone as quickly as possible so they can find a place that suits their needs. And then a lot in this kind of middle territory that focus on how can you, if you're going to have to lay someone off, exactly as you just said with Airbnb, how do you do it as humanly as possible? And how do you make sure that they have a runway? How do you help them on the other side? And I think that middle ground of figuring that out, because I don't necessarily agree with the ground of holding people in the company, because I think sometimes then it is destructive to the rest of the team. And sometimes you're not going to find the right role for them, and it's actually better for them. So I think this middle ground and a beautiful way of figuring that out, about how you're as transparent, how you're as kind, and how you, again, help people on that next journey if they're going to leave the company. And how you have, also it goes back to reviews, like how you have not just episodical reviews once a year, but how you're constantly feeding back and having that two-way conversation so that people can improve, they can understand whether that role may not be the right one for them.
Well, and I've been doing a lot of work lately studying self-managing organizations, or what I sometimes call permissionless organizations, where people feel they can have decision rights pushed right to the edges of the organization. And one of the common themes I find is, yes, absolutely freedom, but also tremendous accountability to peers and to others with whom you are working. And I was joking at an event I was at the other week. I said, well, what people want is, they love the freedom part, the accountability part, well, I'll let my boss handle that.
And you have to have both.
Sorry.
You have to have both. You can't.
Right. So I am interested in so something I see, and I'd be curious as to your perspective, is we seem to be in this like huge, slow, incredibly slow transition from the world of gasoline, suburbs, automobiles, shopping malls, you name it, to this world of digital services, flexible flows, from mass production to micro production. And I think it suggests we need a very different way of working, which is why I find your book so compelling, because it kind of lays out a map for, okay, if the unit of value creation is no longer a massive hierarchy and we're bounded by rules and guardrails, what is it evolving into? And I think you're probably one of the people with the best front row seat at this.
Yeah, it is. I think you're right. It's a really interesting inflection point. And I think the way we've measured success in the past, I think, is going to shift dramatically in this new world. And a part of that is going to be really putting relationships front and center. And that's going to be getting even more important. We're in a lot of conversations right now about AI, and, where does humanity come in as we move more and more towards a world where AI is more prominent. And I feel like that humanity and the relationships are going to be really critical in this new world. And I think there's also going to be new rules of the game. Like I feel, I can't remember if you had Peter Stavros from KKR on your podcast yet, but I think he's onto something really interesting where he's focused on shared ownership models, which change the relationship in a company with an employee, and make them part of the ownership of it. And he's modeled that at KKR with, I think, about 30 companies in his portfolio. And he's found profitability in the companies where they've got it right with the shared ownership model has increased significantly. So I think we're going to be in that. I think that's an interesting inflection point within companies right now, because we're talking part of what you're talking about too in this shift right now. Inequality is so large. There's such a large gap. That shift is going to have to figure out how we minimize that inequality and how we don't increase the gap with AI, how we make sure that that is actually decreased and that everyone has a seat at the table. And I think shared ownership is an interesting one for companies to think about that could help strengthen your companies and could also change the relationship within your company. And it's interesting because I feel like as companies, we focus so much in the past, we focused on production of widgets, profitability, cost ratios, all those types of measurements. We start to get into some of the people ones like employee engagement. But I think in the future, we're going to look more closely at relationships and connections within companies. And one of the things that I found really interesting in the Gallup, it was the Gallup poll, where they found that I think it was something like 79% of people in companies right now are not engaged, 79%, which is extraordinary when you think about that. And can you imagine if we flipped that upside down and you had 79% of people coming into work every day engaged with some type of purpose in their company? We would live in a radically different world. But I think one of the interesting things under that stat is they found that companies that had higher levels of engagement, people within the companies had a best friend at work. Built that ecosystem of trust. So I think that's going to be the interesting thing in this next phase as we move into more of a world that's digital based, that's AI based, is how do we at the same time ensure we don't lose that sense of relationship and those deep friendships that can build those ecosystems of trust in a company. And I think that's where we'll see companies succeed, because right now, I think it's something like 70% of people in the Edelman Trust Barometer feel like leaders are lying to them, whatever sector that is, business, not-for-profit, or government. So I think the companies that can figure out how to bring trust back in and be those centers of trust will be some of the leaders in the future.
Yeah, I do too. So, I mean, one of the things that I admire so much about your work is I think you really laid a groundwork for what this next design of organizations almost needs to be. So if you think about the past technological regime, and the Venezuelan economist Carlota Perez talks about this a lot, which is, we've had these massive underlying technological shifts in the past, and they have tended to follow a pattern. So you've got a bubble period when finance controls everything and it's all about shareholder value and massive inequality and just the kinds of ills that we're experiencing right now, global unrest, a shift in the world order. And then you've got this period of kind of passing through that, and you open the possibility of a new golden age. So if I think of things as disparate as what's a corporation, right? We forget corporation, the way that we run companies now wasn't really formalized till sort of the 1850s. I mean, it was a long time ago. And bureaucracy, which was a big improvement over what came before. Bureaucracy was scientific management, has now kind of taken over. And I just think we're going to see much more devolved, much more ecosystem-based forms of business. And that does imply to me that we need a different kind of metric. And, why is everything being driven by finance? I mean, when you think about it, most of the things that make life worth living are in what the economists call the low productivity sectors, so the arts, culture, education, healthcare, most of the care professions. And I just think we need a different calculus for making sure that those get the resources and are able to do the good for humanity that people want to.
Yeah, and I think it's good for business at the end of the day too. I think one of the interesting things again that Gallup found around those engagement stats was that people not being engaged at work is probably costing us around, I think they estimated something like $8 trillion. And so I think one of the mistakes we made, which you just beautifully eloquently framed, is that I feel like we often make it feel like that it's a negative world ahead of us, when actually it's a better world. It's one we're going to want to run towards that world. And we don't frame it like that and have that vision of what it could be. And I think that's why we get kind of stuck in this process of where we currently are today. And I think your word around ecosystem is really important, because it's also an ecosystem with the planet. And this is something I feel really passionate about, that I think an inflection point in the future will be that companies will start to realize that their profitability is deeply tied to the natural resources that they're building their wealth on the back of. And eventually we will get to that point where it would also be embedded in regulation in a much more significant way, where people will have to pivot. And we've had the good fortune to work with this amazing scientist, Johan Rockström, who created this 9 planetary boundaries with a group of 28 other international scientists. And it's a really interesting framework for business, because yes, you have climate, but you also have biodiversity, you have land use, you have nitrogen phosphorus runoff, which is primarily fertilizer, you have chemical pollution. So it's a really beautiful model to measure not just the impact you're having on the planet, but also the risk to your company of what will happen if we continue to breach those boundaries. Because right now, 6 out of the 9 boundaries are breached. And that is going to put more and more pressure on the bottom lines of companies. And so I feel like that, looking at our businesses from a planetary framing, is an inflection point in the future that will start to happen. And then eventually we will start to have much more significant regulation around it. And again, we're not talking about that enough. We get so lost often in, fighting whether climate change is real or not, or at the end of the day, at the bottom line, if you look at the planet and the boundaries that we're pushing out, all of those boundaries are going to have impact on our bottom line. And that was one of the beautiful things with the ozone community, is that if they hadn't phased out of CFCs, we would be in a much worse position right now with climate change. They probably had one of the most significant positive impacts on climate change over the years. And that's, again, why we love the boundaries. It gives a framework for companies and others to understand where they can have impact and where we sit on those boundaries.
I think it's a hugely important initiative. And if I think of the great advances that have been made in environmental causes, so when I was a kid, right, I would always get car sick. And you ask yourself, well, why? Well, it turns out leaded gasoline is very difficult for some children to tolerate. So we got the lead out of gasoline. We figured out how not to have acid rain, killing off wildlife in the streams and rivers. So these things can be done, and I think we don't hear enough about those kinds of success stories. And I think a lot of times the people doing this work, I'll also say they're not, as you already said, they're not all about ego. They're not all about putting their brand. But the negative of that is they're not out there, on the Sunday talk shows beating the drum either. So, sometimes a little bit of a promotion is a good thing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment, because over the years of sitting with the ozone community, they do have such a deep sense of humility. It's simply extraordinary, that we're not celebrating these people. It is literally the most important, successful collective human achievement of our time. It should be in every university. It should be in every high school. And you're right. It's in part because they are so humble. And that was one of the keys to their success. It's this really interesting dynamic, isn't it, about how we now have I feel, deep responsibility to celebrate them and lift them and make sure that the world hears about them, because I think we have so much to learn from their humility. And it's an interesting thing, humility. Like it's like you can be humble and have that sense of informed confidence as well, which I think, the ozone community has that sense of informed confidence. But I remember at Kofi Annan, who was one of the elders during his celebration of life, one of his team members actually got on stage and they talked about how he had a quiet power, how he still had that sense of power, but he didn't need to be the loudest in the room. He didn't need to be the one demanding all the attention, but he quietly made things happen. And when I think of people like Mary Robinson, or, I think of others like Guilherme Leal, who's at the helm of Natura, this amazing Brazilian company. I think of those types of people that have that quiet power. And I think that quiet power is going to be, in this new world, I think one of the most important leadership qualities is how you make things happen without focusing on hyper-individualism, which is where I think we are right now.
Well, and I would agree with that. And I think we've gotten to a pretty sad place. I'm sure you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work on the impact of particularly social media on young people's development. People spend more time staring at a screen than they do in conversation with other human beings. And people are just feeling very, a lot of they're very isolated. I think a lot of the social institutions that used to tie people together have eroded or aren't getting the time and attention that they need. And there are many, many explanations, but I think there's a hunger for something to replace that. And I think when you talk about these deep connections, people kind of perk up. They want to know more, right? They want to, how do I get some of that in my life?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on about these institutions that have disappeared where we used to come together. And I think business has a really interesting role to play right now in this moment, because if you look at, again, the latest Edelman Trust Barometer, they looked at institutions which were effective, and then ones which also had moral authority. And it was really interesting because business is in that prized upper right-hand quadrant. And you have government and media in that lower left-hand quadrant. And then you have not-for-profits kind of floating just on the other side of business, being less effective than business in terms of people's perspectives. And so I think we have this interesting responsibility and opportunity as companies right now to figure out how we can fill in some of those gaps where people will spend 30% of their lives with us in their companies. Like, how do we make sure that every moment is meaningful? Like one of the Virgin Group HR directors, people directors, we call them in Virgin, had this beautiful quote where they said, it's about the million magic moments, where every single interaction you have with someone, you have a moment to either make or break their day or even their life, or make or break your culture. And so I think we have this opportunity as companies to think about, how do we bring humanity back in the center? How do we create these deep connections and these relationships where people want to come into work? They feel like they're part of something bigger when they come into their office every day. And I think those things will make our companies stronger as well. And I think, again, business leaders have a huge responsibility right now.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. And I think the other dilemma that I think a lot of leaders have, and perhaps your work helps us get out of this, is a lot of them feel very anxious. They feel lonely. They feel that the problems they're being asked to weigh in on are just insurmountable. They feel very alone. And so they haven't built for themselves that deep, I've got your back, I know what you're going through kind of partnerships. For those of you that are just joining us, my guest is Jean Oelwang, and we're talking about many things in addition to her terrific book, Partnering, which is all about a bunch of research she did about truly extraordinary combinations of human beings that accomplished amazing, amazing things. And I think business has that potential. If it's not just a collection of human beings getting a paycheck, but it's really a living, sort of much more organic form. And I think there are examples. So one company that comes to mind is this company called Morningstar. It's a tomato processing company in California. From the beginning, they've really dedicated themselves to self-management. And so I was interviewing one of their former executives the other day, and he said, well, everybody works out what everybody gets paid. We're totally transparent about that. So you get your sort of salary for what the kind of work that you're doing. And then you get a plus because we don't have to pay a whole bunch of managers on top of all that. And I thought that was such an interesting revision to the way we normally think about organizational structures and organizational design, because, if I don't have to pay the manager, I can afford to share more with the employees.
Yeah, and I think these interesting models of companies, I think you're right. There's so many beautiful, like, I don't know if you've ever heard of Buffer, which is this company that, defaults transparency. So everyone knows each other's salaries and it's just they built their company on transparency. But I also feel like Natura falls in that really interesting model where they've built this incredible ecosystem where they work in Brazil with indigenous communities across the Amazon. They have 200 some thousand what they call consultants that work with them. And these consultants are, yes, of course, selling their products, but then they're also looking at working with these families in the Amazon and communities in the Amazon to create new sustainable product ideas. It's just a beautiful example of a company that was also, I think that they were net zero years and years ago, way before the curve. And they've built this ecosystem where people in that company just feel so connected and in control. And so I think you're right. I feel like these companies that are building these ecosystems of relationships. And, my boss did this amazing thing that I love a few years back. So he took this set of circles, and at first he did the first circle, his family. He did the second circle, really close friends of the family, to build these circles of resilience. And this was actually during COVID, when we were going through a really bad time as a company. And then he built the next circle, the company and all of us that work in the company. And then he built the next circle was communities, local and global. And then the next circle was the planet. And it was a really interesting exercise because he mapped out people in those circles that were really critical to him, and invested the time in looking at how he could build those deep connections and relationships. But it was interesting as an exercise because it came full circle too. And we talked about at the end, he actually put himself in the very center of the circle because he realized unless he took care of his own health and started to make sure that that was a priority for him as well, he wouldn't be resilient enough to focus on the other circles that were his circles of resilience as well. So it's just a very interesting exercise, I think, for a leader of any company to go through that process, to think about who are those deep connections and those circles around you that are going to be there in those times when it's really tough, like it was in that moment for us. Because every business we had was human touch. We had hotels, we had airlines, we had health clubs. We just launched a cruise ship. So everything had to shut down. So it was an important moment where he came up with this idea that I think is, again, a really good exercise for everyone to do.
So the circles of connection.
Yeah. And really, because it's really interesting, Rita, like most of our lives will go through our lives and we think we make ourselves. Like we think that we're the ones that are in control of our success, when in reality, it's the people we surround ourselves with who make us who we are in this world. And we put very little time and investment into thinking about that. And so that exercise, I think, helps one think about that and think about those deep connections. And the Ozone community is such a perfect example. Like whenever I'm in their presence, these are friendships that have worked together now for decades, and just the deep and the purpose they have in their lives and the joy they have in their lives. And many of them are in their 70s, 80s now, but they're still doing the work and they still feel so passionate about it. And, if all of us could have that in our lives, and if we can give that gift to people who work with us in our companies, that's an amazing opportunity.
It absolutely is. And a very human one. The other interesting thing that occurs to me is that there's been research which shows that once you have a certain amount of money, like above a certain amount of money, you stop caring about it for what it can do for you. So you can only stay in so many homes. You can only wear so many trousers. You can only eat so much food. And once you get past that point, what starts to happen now is the human, this human quirk that we have, which is all about social comparison, kicks in. And now it becomes, well, how much more do I have than the next guy, or how much more do I have than, and at that point, the hunger for more is bottomless, because you'll never be at a state where you say, hey, that's enough for my material well-being. Let me invest in these other things. And there's actually research that shows these people are miserable. And not that Richard Branson isn't a fabulously wealthy man, but he's also wealthy in all these other ways. The connections and the care and the communities that he's built up around him.
Yeah, and can you imagine if more people in the world, like one of my favorite business leaders is Andy Cooper, who started something called Leapfrog Investments. And, he decided that he was going to point his focus not on making wealth for himself, but how he would build a business that focused on the underserved in the world to help lift them up. And Leapfrog Investments now reaches over 500 million people. They've created over 30 million jobs. And in their portfolio of insurance services and other organizations, the revenue generation per annum is about $7 billion. And so I feel like this is an interesting inflection point that's going to be coming in the world too, is understanding that there's business opportunity in uplifting people, and that is going to bring you more meaning and joy in your life than just building a company to figure out how you can earn more money for yourselves. I remember being in a conversation once with a group of people directors, and them like insisting that CEOs needed to earn a certain amount of money, or you're not going to attract the right person, and there's a balance in there. I think we've got so out of control with that. And how do you make sure that there's a balance where it's not all about that? It's about, what kind of company they're building. Someone who I love, who I think built some great organizations. I had the real privilege of working for him when he was CEO of Virgin Mobile in the US. It was Dan Schulman, who was the CEO then of, I think, American Express, PayPal in his career. I think he just retired now from PayPal. But he had such a focus on how do you uplift everyone in your company, in your communities. And I can remember years ago when we were working with him, when on purpose, we sent him out on the streets with his team with $1, and they had to spend 24 hours on the streets of New York. And it was a really interesting, humbling experience for the entire leadership team about understanding what it's like for someone to have nothing on the streets of New York. And it changed the whole framing and perspective of that leadership team. And, Dan was up for all kinds of stuff like that to make sure that they were really understanding the issues that they were going to get behind.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that I find astonishing when I talk to senior leaders is oftentimes how little they know about what's really going on in their companies. A famous example was Mark Bertolini when he was CEO of Aetna. And one of his employees finally came to him and said she'd been volunteering at a food bank. And she said, do you understand that your most lowly paid under employees are coming to a food bank? And you are, a major multinational company with billions and billions in revenue, and your people have to come to a food bank? And he said it just struck him like a thunderclap. And he was one of the very first CEOs to say, okay, we're going to raise our minimum wages to, it was $15 an hour. We're not talking life-altering amounts of money, but at least they didn't have to go to the food bank. And a lot of other CEOs were very critical, as I recall. But it turned out to be okay. Well, I don't want to impose more on your time. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. So you've got the Planetary Guardians. You've got your own foundation. You've also got all these other little organizations that are moving the world in a better direction. If people want to be helpful or get involved, what should they do?
Yeah, and we'd welcome anyone to collaborate with what we're doing right now. And they can go to pluswonder.org, which is the not-for-profit behind the book, partnering all around how we spark relationships and deep connections of purpose in the world, or Planetary Guardians or Virgin Unite. And Virgin Unite has an ecosystem now of about 22 different organizations that we've incubated and spun out into the world. So we'd love to partner with anyone that's listening to this. And again, just a big thank you to you, Rita, the work you're doing, the relationships and the connections and the network you've built. I heard about you before I met you because you got an award in Ireland, actually, and I was with this community, and they were just singing your praises. And anyway, so just a huge thank you for all you've done in this.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the next time we can meet in real life.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you again.